You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by San Pellegrino Ciao. A gift from Italy to your home. San Pellegrino Ciao is a flavored sparkling water made with real fruit juice, finished with a pinch of Sicilian salt for a perfectly balanced taste. So which flavor will you choose? Peach, lime, blood orange, cherry, or maybe the all-new limoncello? Crafted in Italy with 0 grams of added sugar. San Pellegrino Ciao. Buy it now.
A burst pipe. A dead water heater. The AC calling it quits. Who do you call? HomeServe is an easy way to handle unexpected home repairs with plans covering stuff basic homeowners insurance usually won't. Instead of scrambling for a contractor, you make one call to get the repair process started. Join the millions of customers who trust HomeServe right now. Go to homeserve.com/podcast for 50% less your first year. That's homeserve.com/podcast. Savings compared to renewal price void in Florida.
Hello everyone and welcome to another History of the Second World War Q&A episode, the 6th installment of what has become a monthly addition to the podcast feed. Remember, if you have questions, you can send them in to historyofthesecondworldwar@outlook.com or toss them to me on Discord or on Blue Sky or however you may know to contact me. If you were to send in a question, you could end up like listener Ari, whose question I'm about to read. Quote, how did the combination of Greece's mountainous geography and the strategic priorities of Axis powers, particularly Italy's failed invasion and subsequent German intervention, shape the outcome of the Greco-Italian War and the geopolitical consequences for Greece during the early Cold War period? This is an interesting question, mostly because it ties into a wider theme within the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, particularly those that had strong resistance to the German occupation during the war. During the years of occupation, Greece was generally a hotbed for partisan and resistance activity. The geography, as Ari mentioned, and the overall lack of forces available for the occupation played a major role in allowing that resistance to, if not flourish, at the very least continue to exist as a strong force within Greek society. This was true regardless of who was doing the occupation. German versus Italian did not matter much when it came to the Greeks forming a resilient resistance. But if it was resilient, it was also heavily fractured, which would set the stage for the Greek Civil War in the years after the Second World War. The Civil War would be caused primarily by the most important problem that every post-war government would face when they took back control of the countries that had been occupied: how to unify the people and the resistance. When the Greek resistance groups had operated during the war, they had all been fighting for their own version of the future of Greece. Monarchists wanted the king to return. Communists wanted, communism. And then on through every different ideology around which resistance groups had been united. During the war, these groups often worked together, or at the very least did not actively try and destroy one another. But with the hated Germans and Italians removed from the equation, the question became not about surviving the occupation, but about building Greece's future. In some countries, the unifying drive between the groups would prevent open warfare. France would be a good example here. But in Greece, it would boil out into real fighting that would take place from 1946 to 1949. During the Civil War, geography was once again important because the communist forces, using the name the Democratic Army of Greece, would be based in the more mountainous terrain of northern Greece. From that position, they were more protected from the government's forces, and they could also receive aid and support from the countries to the north: Yugoslavia, Albania, and Bulgaria. Initially, the Greek government was supported by the British, although they would eventually give way to the Americans, who would support the Greek government all the way to victory. Unlike later Cold War proxy wars, the Soviet Union was not directly involved with the fighting. Stalin instead chose to honor the wartime agreements that placed Greece within the British sphere of influence. The Civil War would see over 100,000 Greeks killed, and would be the perfect example of how turbulent post-war periods can be after a lengthy period of resistance to a foreign invader. Next up, we have a question from Andrew. Quote, if Operation Barbarossa had succeeded during 1942, could the Allies have won the war? We're going to have to make some assumptions with this one. First up, Operation Barbarossa was the name for just the German operation in the middle of 1941, with later attacks in 1941 and 1942 being given different names. So let's assume you mean the German summer offensives in 1942, which would see them reach their high water mark on the Eastern Front. This series of attacks would last from roughly the end of June 1942 all the way to the end of the year, and were referred to as Case Blue. These are the battles that involved Stalingrad, for those trying to understand the timeline here. For the purposes of this question, let's assume that it achieved its objectives, and that the Soviets negotiated some kind of armistice afterwards, because there's no way the Germans were going all the way into Siberia. So we have to assume at some point that the Soviets would want to find their way out of the war, and they wouldn't resist till some sort of bitter end. The question would be, do the Allies, assuming the Western Allies, still win? This is a challenging alternative history type of question because there are two things that come into conflict when trying to determine what would have happened. It's difficult to see what the Germans could have done to force the Allies to surrender, particularly with the growing American commitment to British defense. On the other hand, it's difficult to see what the British and Americans could have done, at least in the medium or short and medium term, against a German military that was no longer encumbered by the massive commitments that had to be made to the Eastern Front. The American war machine was growing in strength basically by the day in late 1942, but at the same time, maybe the Germans could have found a way to solve some of their resource issues based on territory occupied in the Soviet Union. But the Germans were really bad at extracting value from the East because doing so required them to build up infrastructure or support the existing infrastructure, both of which they were bad at. At the same time, what would the Western Allies have done if their bombing campaigns had been met by drastically greater resources? If the Germans could just focus everything on pumping out fighters and anti-aircraft guns, those Allied bombing raids would have been even more suicidal. I think I come down on I'm not sure on this one. I don't think the Soviet surrender in late 1942 had an obvious outcome of the war, and the most likely outcome would probably have been some sort of long delay in the end of the conflict, pending the Soviet Union maybe opting to come back in later. It's just a little unclear to me. And I think you have to make a ton of assumptions and leaps. And I think the solution is probably a long way away from what happened in history. I think you're going to have to get real deep into kind of alt history timelines and theorizing to come to a solution of Soviet Union leaves late 1942, what happens to America, the UK, and Germany during the rest of the conflict. Probably beyond the scope of this answer. Next up, we have a question from Lucas, which is a long one, but I'm going to read it all. Quote, economies evolved quite a bit between 1914 and 1939. Some more than others. What economic innovations do you think played the largest role in shaping the conduct and outcome of the Second World War? Some things are obvious. The 5-year plans transformed the USSR's industrial base. Japanese expansion into and development of Manchuria was absolutely essential to their ability to wage war at scale. However, others are less obvious. For example, the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in the US in 1914 created the tools that the FDR administration would use to manage the US monetary system. Given the sale of US lending, both domestic and foreign, it's hard to overstate the importance of increased control over the monetary system. Another that comes to mind immediately was the lowering of tariffs that occurred during the Great Depression. Have you run across any particular economic changes or innovations that you believe were particularly influential to the conduct of the war? End quote. Lucas is correct in that there were many economic choices made during the interwar years and before that played an important role in the structure and outcome of the Second World War. Just on the Federal Reserve, you're absolutely correct that its foundation before the First World War was very helpful when the United States was in positions after 1941 to need to spend a tremendous amount of money on wartime production and operations. It would allow the U.S. war economy to run without being greatly hindered by something as silly as money, with the needs of the war being placed above any type of monetary policy that may have gotten in the way. In the end, it worked out quite well for the country, with the demands of the wartime production seeing spending on infrastructure and production capacity on scales that had never been dreamed of before. Those investments would serve the nation well after 1945. I think there are a few more examples of crucial economic policy decisions made in Europe and around the world that would have a major impact on the course of the Second World War. The first was the gold standard, something we discussed in detail quite a while ago on the podcast. Essentially, the gold standard was considered to be a critical part of how an economy should run, both before and after the First World War. In the gold standard, a nation's currency is pegged to gold at a specific ratio of currency per ounce of gold. It was just considered to be economic orthodoxy and a desirable setup because it gave everything predictability when it came to international commerce. But in the difficult years of the 1920s and then the Great Depression, the gold standard would become a millstone around the neck of many economies. For everybody, it would limit their ability to control their imports and exports during the challenging years of the Great Depression, making it difficult to enact the policies that were believed to be ways to solve some of the economic issues caused by the collapse. For other nations, well, they just made mistakes from the beginning and it would cost them, like the French who pegged their currency at a rate that was too high during the 1920s when they came back onto the gold standard, which made it difficult for French manufacturers to be competitive on the global market because of the exchange rates, because of how they interacted with the gold standard. Similarly, the fears of hyperinflation would play an important role in shaping the German economy of the 1930s. After the experiences of the German people during the Weimar period, Hitler and other German leaders were scared of inflation, like very scared of inflation, out of fear that it would lead to hyperinflation. These fears would lead to the creation of the MIFO bills, would cause wages to be artificially controlled, and would also cause price controls to be introduced far earlier than other nations would on the run-up to the war. These were necessary because the massive amounts of money being spent on the German rearmament efforts were bound to cause inflation, and so efforts were made to control that inflation as much as possible. Those efforts were not long-term solutions, though. For example, the MIFO bills, which were basically just government IOUs to German industrialists, would eventually come due, and the government would have to pay them. The economic pressure of these anti-inflation efforts would be one of the reasons that the Germans would push for an early start of the war in 1939, even before their rearmament efforts were complete, and well before many of their enemies had even really gotten started on their own rearmament drives. From a terrorist perspective, I think Lucas has it backwards here. It's so easy to get things confused in this economic realm of history, because tariffs would actually increase over the course of the 1930s. But this was not odd or weird. Up until quite recently at the time of this recording, the run of open trade around the world, led by the post-World War II United States, is the opposite of how many economies have run for most of history, and especially after the First World War. Tariffs and other protectionist policies were already in place before the Great Depression, and the economic issues caused by the Depression would only make things worse. More and higher tariffs would be put in place by many nations after 1930, including the United States. The U.S. would introduce the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930, which deserves particular attention as a bill that drastically increased the tariffs on thousands of imported products. This created a retaliation cascade by many of the most important economies that the United States interacted with. It was a real nightmare that many economists claim made an impact on the Great Depression and actually made its effects far worse, not better. That's just one example of economic laws that were put in place to erect similar barriers. The Ottawa Accords put protections around the British Commonwealth and its kind of economic agreements within that Commonwealth, and the Germans would put in place various protections for the German industry and economy that were deemed crucial to the future war efforts. These actions would cause problems, and would for some make the economic situation in the 1930s more difficult, and make rearmament more difficult afterwards. But it's probably not correct to say that it was all negative. Some of those protectionist policies would be useful after 1939 when the war would make its own economic barriers. I'm sure many people were quite happy about the economic protections put in place to insulate British farmers from economic competition. Just one example, sort of pulling from a list. They would need those farmers once the German U-boat campaign started. They needed to produce their own food, and they would boost up that part of the economy more and more and more through protectionist policies during the 1930s. So it's hard to say one way or the other whether those protectionist tariffs were bad or good. I think one of the most important parts of economic policy that was important during the late 1930s and into the war years was not a specific law or tariff or policy, but instead a shift in mindset of many governments in Europe, in particular around deficit spending. For most of the 1930s, and for most decades before that, many governments were adamant that deficit spending had to be avoided. It caused entire governments to fall in France. Well, actually, it probably caused like 12 governments to fall in France. There was a lot. But much like the gold standard, it was never seen as simply a thing that could be done. You just did not deficit spend. You balanced the budget year by year. If a government wanted to spend more, it needed to raise more money in taxes and other revenues. That viewpoint, I think, can be difficult for particularly modern Americans to think about, given the fact that since the start of this episode, the U.S. budget deficit has been, $75 million. How long have we been here? 15 minutes? Something like that. Compare this to several French governments of the 1930s, which would be replaced specifically because they could not agree on how to balance the budget for a single year. Such a firm stance against deficit spending caused issues as some nations tried to begin rearmament, with France and Britain in particular impacted. Their government simply refused to just start spending money willy-nilly. They had to have a very specific economic plan in place. And at the same time, Germany was just spending things left and right. Money was not an object. I guess at the end of this answer, I'll just say that economic policy and the impacts of that policy remain probably an under-discussed part of the whole history of the Second World War. Much like the First World War, the Second World War would in many ways be won in the factories at home, just as much as on the battlefield. And in the end, the side that won was the one that could maintain the required economic output for longer than their enemies, which is one of the reasons that the entry of the United States was so important, because its area of economic production was so safe from attack, which none of the other nations involved, particularly in Europe, could really say.
This episode is brought to you by San Pellegrino Ciao. A gift from Italy to your home. San Pellegrino Ciao is a flavored sparkling water made with real fruit juice, finished with a pinch of Sicilian salt for a perfectly balanced taste. So which flavor will you choose? Peach, lime, blood orange, cherry, or maybe the all-new limoncello? Crafted in Italy with 0 grams of added sugar. San Pellegrino Ciao. Buy it now.
A burst pipe. A dead water heater. The AC calling it quits. Who do you call? HomeServe is an easy way to handle unexpected home repairs, with plans covering stuff basic homeowners insurance usually won't. Instead of scrambling for a contractor, you make one call to get the repair process started. Join the millions of customers who trust HomeServe right now. Go to homeserve.com/podcast for 50% less your first year. That's homeserve.com/podcast. Savings compared to renewal price, void in Florida.
Next up is a question from listener Oliver. I've been listening for a long time, and I'd love to hear about the Royal Navy Division's participation in the First World War, as I am not only serving in the Royal Navy myself, but it is also, to my best knowledge, that this is the first and only time that the Royal Navy has provided infantry troops to fight as infantry at a large scale. Yes, Oliver, you're absolutely correct that, at least to my knowledge as well, it is the only time the Royal Navy has committed a large number of troops into a strictly infantry role. The division was formed at the start of the war due to the fact that there were thousands of naval reservists who were not needed by the Royal Navy at the time, and so it was thought that the best thing that could be done with them was to organize and equip them as infantry and let them join the fighting on the continent. This firmly falls under a decision that was made under the assumption that the First World War would be over within a period of weeks or months. It was not going to last years. That would be absurd. But at least in the initial actions of the division, the fact that they were naval reservists who had been given infantry training was not a big deal. This was because the first 2 actions that they would participate in were the landing at Antwerp during the opening weeks of the war, with some thought to possibly holding the city before it was ultimately abandoned. They were then sent to the Mediterranean, and eventually they would fight on Gallipoli. Both of those battles were closely related to the Royal Navy, so it kind of made sense. But then the division just sort of became what was essentially a standard infantry division on the Western Front, participating in a series of major battles from 1916 until the end of the war. They never lost some of their unique naval features, with different uniforms and slightly different procedures, but they were treated as and largely fought as standard British infantry. The British did not follow this path during the Second World War, although other nations would, with both the Germans and the Soviets fielding infantry divisions made up of men from their respective navies at various points in the war. The general cause of this was the same that had happened in Britain in 1914. The navies just found themselves with more men than they needed, and they would be of better use fighting on land. Technically, the Japanese Navy also had infantry forces, but they were not improvised during the war and were instead prepared before the war to carry out landings on the various islands that the Japanese Navy planned on invading in their campaign across the Pacific. The British did not follow suit with this. They did not have naval infantry divisions during the Second World War, and I've not found definitive proof as to why. I've not found a document that says, hey, we're not doing this time because of XYZ, but my assumption based on everything I know about the British preparations for war in 1939 is that the Royal Navy probably did not have as many sort of excess people that they could call upon to form such a force due to all the budget constraints that this service had been placed under during the 1920s and 30s. The Royal Navy before the First World War was a little higher on spending priority by the British government, and so had more money and probably had more reservists at that time that they could call upon, which didn't exist in 1939. Final question from listener Cedarbright. Who do you think were the Cassandras, in the Greek mythological sense, of the interwar period, who never got the credit for it? The people who made the right warnings or forecast the right things before anyone else did, whether it was political, military, scientific, economic trends, etc. This is a challenging question because I think it's important to separate people who were correct in their warnings and forecasts because they understood something others did not, from the people who just so happened to be right out of luck or chance. There can also be a good amount of rewriting of history after the fact to try and recast how some individuals reacted to events based on what would happen later. I think that Churchill often gets put in this Cassandra light during the 1930s due to him sort of being cast out into political exile due to his views on India. And he certainly was not a fan of Hitler during the late 1930s, but those predictions are, I think, clouded by his other views. During the 1920s and the first half of the 1930s, Churchill, big Mussolini fan, who was at the time pursuing a fascist ideology which was at least in the same ballpark as what the Nazi Party was discussing during its rise to prominence in the last years of the 1920s. I think this paints Churchill's change in views about Mussolini and Italy in the second half of the 1930s in a different light. But I'm sure that somebody like Churchill is not who you're asking about here, so I'm going to go with a more obscure figure, William Dodd. Dodd was the American ambassador in Germany from 1933 to 1937, and his time there would be spent sending warning after warning after warning back to the United States about what was happening in Germany, the rapid remilitarization that was happening under Hitler, and just a general warnings about what Germany was probably going to do in the future. These views and warnings really put him at odds with the prevailing views back in Washington, which would be generally accepting of Hitler's regime in Germany and even most of the rhetoric that he was using at the time. Dodd was so anti-Nazi in his views that he refused to attend official Nazi Party functions even when invited, which was something of a faux pas. The disconnect between Dodd and Washington got so bad that eventually he was simply replaced, and he would be replaced by Hugh Wilson, who was seen as a more reliable and calm individual. There are, of course, many other examples of this type of individual. Anytime there's a major event like the Second World War that's driven by major political forces, somebody usually makes the prediction that bad things will happen, and some of them will be right. But Dodd was very right, and it's unfortunate that nobody really listened to him at the time. Maybe America would have been in a different position in the late 1930s and 1939, even in 1941, if his warnings had been listened to. That's all the questions we have for today. Don't forget, if you want your questions answered, hit me up at historyofthesecondworldwar at outlook.com.